Welcome back to the Journey Behind the Shark documentary. Today I want to share something that became very important in my filmmaking process, which was getting permission to film sharks in French Polynesia. I wrote down some notes that I want to cover in this episode, so don't mind me if I look down now and then. But yeah, I want to clear up, I didn't travel to French Polynesia and then realized I had to get a permit. Of course, that was like part of my preparation, research, when I decided to make a film about French Polynesia's shark protection. So one of the main reasons I chose French Polynesia for my film Where Sharks Belong is their history of shark protection. So when I was planning this documentary, I knew I wanted to travel somewhere where I knew that sharks were protected. So that made me wonder, if I'm coming there specifically to film sharks for a documentary, what am I allowed to do? What am I allowed to actually film or capture? So I started researching, and that's when I came across the Direction de l'Environnement, or DIREN, which is the government authority responsible for preservation and management of French Polynesia's biodiversity and natural environments. So under French Polynesia's environmental code, species are kind of divided into categories. So category A covers species that are considered vulnerable or endangered, while category B covers species that are rare or of special interest. And so sharks are a protected species there. So DIREN has a specific authorization process when it comes to filming these protected species. And so for sharks and green turtles, there's an application specifically for photography and filming. And then there's a separate authorization process for marine mammals like whales and so on. And yeah, DIREN currently has like an application process where you have to apply for a permit in order to photograph and film these protected species if you want to use it for commercial use. So if you're using your photos and footage for commercial use, you have to have that permit. And so I think it's quite a good thing. When I knew that I wanted to use the footage for my documentary, I knew I had to have that permit. So I got in contact with DIREN, and for my application I had to explain what I was filming, which species I intended to film, where and when I planned to do it, and how I would approach the animals. And so the application also distinguishes filming on land, drone, and underwater. So my permit had to cover all three aspects, and also I had to say what kind of technique I'm using. Am I free diving, scuba diving? And you can just cross whatever you're using. It's not a permit for each activity or like each location, so one for drone, one for underwater, and one for land. It's all in one. You just have to tick whatever applies to you and then provide them with additional documents. Those additional documents or supporting documents were insurance, detailed letter explaining the project, methodology, and synopsis, from what I remember. Once I got the permit, there were conditions attached to it. So I have to provide the finished work to DIREN for their archives. And I also have to disclose that I have a permit on photos and videos I make publicly available. Which personally I think is great, because if people see, oh, she got a permit to take that photo, for example, on Instagram or on my website, then people might do some research and think, oh, if I travel to French Polynesia, do I also have to have a permit? And that kind of brings me to Whakarava, because that's where most of my filming in June, July happened. And Whakarava got famous because of its grey shark aggregation, and it got famous as the Wall of Sharks. And due to a lot of tourism that came to that specific and small island in the south of Whakarava, locals noticed that there was changing behavior in like the sharks and just other animals as well. So DIREN got very strict with permits that they give out. And so I wasn't allowed to use the footage I captured in the South Pass, where like the biggest wall of grey sharks was. It was incredible to see. I took footage, but it's only for my personal use. So only for me. I will never post it. It's to show my family and friends, but yeah, it's not going to be publicly available because that's not permitted. You're allowed to take footage, but you can't use it commercially. So yeah, unfortunately, I can't show these incredible photos and videos I took in the South Pass because I'm not allowed to, but I checked with my contact person at DIREN, very, very detailed where I'm allowed to film, what footage I'm allowed to use. And so like freediving and snorkeling around the jetty where the hotel is, that I was allowed to use. So that's where I spent most of my days when I was in the South. So yeah, that kind of shows a little negative side of photography and filmmaking, because when people see something now that it's so accessible, they want to travel there and see it for themselves, but that had just a negative impact on Fakarava, like the South Pass. So at some point, protecting what made this place so famous came first. And personally, I think that's a really great principle. And I also think there's an awareness issue here about this topic, because during this process, I realized that not everyone knows that you need a permit in French Polynesia to film and photograph specific species if you use it for commercial use. But yeah, because French Polynesia covers such an enormous area, I believe it's quite difficult to know exactly who's filming what, at what point, where, and what are they using it for. But I think maybe communicating it more broadly, and that's why I also think it's such an important thing to disclose that you have a permit, because then you can maybe positively influence someone that is aware of animal protection, that they think twice, oh, I'm going to French Polynesia, I might need to look into getting a permit. So I think what could be amazing is if you book a dive, or when you arrive at the diving center, but even actually when you book the dive, there should be like a sentence saying, are you planning on using this footage for commercial use? Then please check with DIREN for like a permit. Because it's such a small step. Because I know that professional photographers or people who plan on using the photos they take for commercial use, they know that they're bringing their camera. It's not about all the tourists that just take photos for their memories, because they don't need a permit, right? But it's about people who use their footage professionally and commercially. There should be like a sentence saying, oh, are you using that footage? Are you planning on using that footage later? Please check with DIREN. So, and the more I thought about this actually fits perfectly with the documentary I'm making, Where Sharks Belong, because Where Sharks Belong essentially asks the question, what can we learn from places that have protected sharks over a long, long time? And French Polynesia's approach didn't start with a permit, of course. It has a long history, and that's why this place is so special. So French Polynesia's shark protection story began in 2006 when they prohibited shark fishing across their waters. So sharks were given legal protection under French Polynesia's environmental code. And then in 2018, French Polynesia created Tainui Atea, a managed marine area covering more than 4.5 million square meters of its ocean territory. And then 2025, last year, something significant happened. At the UN Ocean Conference last year in Nice, French Polynesia announced strengthened protections for Tainui Atea and classification of its exclusive economic zone as a marine protected area. So that made Tainui Atea the world's largest marine protected area. But that reminds me, I have to explain. So calling an entire area a marine protected area doesn't mean that all 4.5 plus million square meters are a no-take reserve where nobody can fish. There are different levels to marine protected areas, and 2025 commitments included around 1.1 million square kilometers of highly or fully protected ocean, including approximately 900,000 square kilometers of fully protected areas and roughly 200,000 square kilometers of strongly protected coastal zones. And other parts are managed for sustainable use, which is important to have these levels of protection. But yeah, it's still the largest marine protected area, which is incredible. Effective protection isn't just drawing a shape on a map. It's about what is happening in that shape. So questions like what activities are allowed, what isn't allowed, how are wildlife and habitats protected, how are rules enforced, how are local communities involved, how are those protections actually working. That's also why something small as filming permits kind of are important, because it's kind of a tiny part of a bigger picture, because access to nature comes with responsibility. That's why the permit is so important, because I feel like photography and documentaries, they are a conversation tool. And so someone might be watching a documentary and it ignites a fire to protect this area, or do something in their country to protect the ocean and its inhabitants. And what I've also learned from my experience is when people see animals, even if it's not just in a real life encounter, but also in a film, they start caring about that animal. And that's why, yeah, filmmaking and documentaries are so important. But that's why when we tell these stories, it's so important to tell them responsibly. And that's maybe something that other wildlife destinations can learn from French Polynesia. To ask for such a permit when you take photos of wildlife. Because I think it comes down to a bigger question: what do we have to do so that people decades from now can still see these amazing animals? And so this permit kind of became a big part of my documentary, because my documentary started with the question, what happens if we protect sharks? And the more time I've spent making this documentary, I've learned that protection isn't just one single decision. It's a series of decisions about fishing, protected areas, wildlife encounters, and even how we point our cameras at the animal we're trying to protect. So yeah, I hope you learned something about filming permits, photography permits, just like maybe it sparked your interest in checking where you're going next if you have to have a permit. And remember, if you're going to French Polynesia and you want to use your footage commercially, please contact DIREN to get that permit. But yeah, I think that's it for this video. I hope you liked it, and if you haven't already, please check out my other videos where I talked about how I got to French Polynesia. I showed you tips and tricks, and what else? I actually don't remember, so go watch it. And I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!